unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Hello, welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with John Danner, who teaches at UC Berkeley at the Haas School. He also teaches at Princeton University, and he's the author of two books. One, most recent one here, is called Built for Growth. He's a co-author of this book, and another book here, which is called The Other F Word, co-authored with our friend Mark Coopersmith, also here at Berkeley. So welcome, John. Great to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Greg.
So I thought maybe we'd start by talking about the other F word. For people who are fans of Silicon Valley, for people who come here and visit, people who study here, I mean, you hear it all the time, right? You hear the distinguishing feature of Silicon Valley, or at least one of them, is that we embrace failure. You know, you have to learn to fail, that you have to be proud of your failures, that, you know, failure is not something that, you should let it get in your way, and that people who have failed rise to the top and so forth. To what extent has this just become kind of a cliche and kind of one of these overused myths that people talk about? And to what extent is this something that, hey, you know, we really need to dig deep into this, figure out what is meant by this, and really own it?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that a lot of that is part of the sloganeering around Silicon Valley. It's easy to say when you're celebrating failure, when you're celebrating people who went from a colossal failure to some huge success, right? That makes it feel like you're very failure savvy. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think Silicon Valley is all that wiser, or all that more comfortable with the dimensions of failure. When Mark and I decided to write this book, it was really motivated by a very simple question, and that is, how can people turn failure, which is kind of the necessary concomitant of being human, from what it always is, which is a regret, into what could potentially be a strategic resource. And we understand all the mottos about fail fast, fail forward, and all that kind of stuff. We really wanted to go much deeper than that and give people a sense of how do you turn this common phenomenon, this natural phenomenon, into something that really does have a very unique strategic value to it, unlike almost any other strategic resource you can think about. Because what failure almost always is reality's way of telling you you weren't as smart as you thought you were. You were conducting an experiment all along, and it's reality that's telling you what you didn't know that you thought you did. So it's got some value for sure.
Yeah. So in this podcast, a lot of the people that I talk to are really focused on strategy, right? And focused on organizational design and how organizations can succeed. But I like to think that most of the things that we talk about in strategy about organizations are applicable to individuals, right? Because individuals have to plot their own strategy, and for us, really, self-knowledge is such a huge part of it, right? So I'm certainly interested in the question of how to live, and I think a lot of what you were writing about is really about self-knowledge and how we need to know better, what our limitations are and what our capabilities are if we want to achieve our goals.
Yeah, there's something quintessentially human about failure, that connects all of us, because we are all expert at it. We do it all the time in very unexpected ways. Yet we tend too often to walk away from it, to ignore it, to not talk about it. And it's become, I think, a taboo unto itself, but also from a leadership point of view. In my experience, both in teaching, consulting, and running organizations, starting organizations, it is a huge barrier in most organizations that I'm familiar with. If you can't talk about failure, if you can't genuinely, honestly, openly discuss it and understand what's behind it, you're never going to be in a position to actually leverage and benefit from it. And that's an odd thing, because failure is the one resource that you've already paid for. You've already made the mistake.
Mhm.
Something bad has already happened. Something that you didn't want to has already happened. you might as well go back in and figure out what it is that was wrong. Was it an assumption? Was it execution? Was it framing a problem wrong? Not enough information? It could be any number of factors, but if you walk away from it too soon, you've lost the ability to have your past mistakes improve the odds that you're going to make better decisions going forward.
Well, I mean, is that just another way of kind of paraphrasing Thomas Edison and others who have said that there's I don't call anything a failure. I just call it an opportunity for learning.
Well,
Is that
Edison,
really?
Edison's got a lot of pithy quotes about failure for sure, and his experience, vindicates some of those quotes. He was a very focused, resilient guy, a constant inventor, and to some extent, the Edison spirit is, I think, part of what organizations still have to learn and what individuals have to learn. But saying it is one thing, doing it and acting on it is another. And that's where the real difficulty lies because too many executives in companies aren't vulnerable enough. They don't show their humanity enough, and it creates this illusion that somehow or another, the higher you go in the organization, the less fallible you are. And if you compound that by creating the illusion that your culture is going to be the first in the world that where failure is not an option, where you expect excellence all the time, you are ironically potentially setting up your organization to be an organization that covers up its failures, that
Mhm.
waits until too long to deal with the consequences of failure. And those consequences become exacerbated because of it, become more expensive to fix it, and worse, become less likely to inform your next round of decision making.
Right. So in organizations, right, we all know about the shoot the messenger phenomenon, and we all know that in many organizations, right. I'm thinking in particular of the Soviet Union, a great example. We think about Chernobyl. You think about the invasion of the Soviet Union back in 1941 and so forth, where the goal, or think about uh, in the famine in China, where the administrators were reluctant to tell their superiors any bad news for fear that they would be held accountable for that bad news. Um, to what extent is that analogous to what we do as individuals, right? I mean, we don't want to tell ourselves the bad news. We don't want, in other words, it's almost as if we have multiple personalities, and there's some part of us that's aware of our failures, and some other part that's responsible for our self-image that suppresses that information and punishes that part of ourselves that kind of sends that message.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a wizard in the depths of human nature, but it strikes me that very few of us want to be masochistic. Um, it's not fun to beat yourself up. It's not easy often to admit your weaknesses or acknowledge your failures. Um, but the interesting thing about failure, and this is an insight that comes from Dan Kahneman's work. Um, Kahneman was giving a TED talk. I happened to be in the audience when he was doing it, and he made the statement that for most of us, our futures are the projections of our remembered
Mhm.
pasts. And I remember hearing that and jotting it down in my notebook at the time and underlining it and asterisking it. And I just got curious about that statement. And later I had a chance to both talk with him and obviously read his books. But what one of the points that he makes is that human beings' memory is very much emotionally connected. And it's connected in particular to how experiences end. And the implication of that vis-a-vis failure is quite profound, I think. And I oftentimes in my classes on failure, both at Berkeley and at Princeton, I ask people to think about a failure in their professional lives, their resume failures, if you will. Um, and I give them a little bit of time to think about it, and then they swap stories about it with their neighbor, which is an interesting experience in and of itself. But after that exercise, I asked them, when was that failure that you thought about? Was it in the last 6 months, last year, last 5 years? And the older the audience, obviously, the longer the time frame is. But it's often not at all unusual for people to remember a failure 5, 6, 10, 15 years ago. And Kahneman's point about that is that we remember things emotionally
Mhm.
that end significantly for us. And when you think about how failures often end for people in our personal lives or in our professional lives, they usually don't end well emotionally. And what that does is it reinforces the memory of failure, which in turn distorts our fear of failure going forward. So what it means is, in an organizational context, and I think also in a personal context, we're less likely to try something new, to take a risk in an area that we've made a failure in before, and tends to shut down our willingness to explore the next opportunity, to understand ourselves, to go back and try to become a better version of what we were trying to do before, or maybe even in an organizational context, to innovate, to
Mhm.
take risks, to step out of the norm, to think out of the proverbial box, if you will. So that reinforcing loop of memory and fear is what makes failure such a difficult thing for organizations and I think for individuals to come to terms with.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's two things you could explore there. I mean, on the one hand, like regret avoidance is really at the heart of this, where you're contemplating that if you do fail, you're going to look back on yourself in a negative way, and you don't want that. But we also kind of calibrate, right? And I think Kahneman's also made the point that we're really bad at affective forecasting, and
Very
so
much so.
even though we may look back on things and feel terribly, we probably feel less bad than we thought we would, and we probably overestimate the degree to which we, we'll feel
It's
bad,
an
right?
unfair, uh, it's an unfair deck that we've been dealt to some extent. When I read Kahneman's work, I actually asked him this. I said, Dan, it seems to me like if you follow the logic of your experiments all the way out, there's no such thing as free will. There's we're trapped. We're trapped in these unconscious mental biases, looking backwards, and we're trapped in them looking forwards. So, what are we doing? Flipping coins all the time and kidding ourselves? But it does, to me, reinforce something. I don't know, Greg, what your experience has been, but the thing that I continue to marvel at, um, and I think it's a dimension of just being human, is we are so great at rationalizing. We'd like to presume that we're rational, but what we really are doing most of the time is rationalizing.
Mhm.
We're making decisions from emotional grounds and then trying to make ourselves feel better by packaging them in rational terms. And that's a tough nut to crack open, I think.
It seems that, if we want people to feel more comfortable failing, we need to get them to adjust either the probability of success or their assessment of the consequences of success. And if people are failing too little, then it seems like um, they're they're overestimating the likelihood of failing. But I think if you read the literature on overconfidence, it seems people seem to be underestimating the probability of failure. So how do we reconcile this idea that we see a lot of overconfidence, but then at the same time we see a lot of fear of failure?
Yeah, I'll give you two analogies that may bear on that. The first is courtesy of my co-author Mark Coopersmith. When we were writing our book and comparing notes on the interviews and research that we had done, we were sitting out on his deck having breakfast one day, and he said, the analogy that comes to mind is that failure is like gravity. And I said, bingo. It is a force and fact of nature. It is inexorable. It is unavoidable. And it's not a strong force of nature. It's a weak force of nature, but it is that kind of phenomenon that I think we're dealing with. And the other analogy that I would use, that I've been using in some of my classes and talks lately, is if you think about this in athletic terms, right? think about the batting average, for example, in baseball, that it would qualify you to be in the Hall of Fame, right? You're probably going to have a batting average, if you're lucky, in the high 300s, maybe, and that's phenomenal. Well, what does that mean? That means, from a batting point of view, you're failing, 2/3 of the time almost, right? You put it in basketball terms. It's incredibly unlikely that you will end a career, or even in a game, if you're a shooter, making more than half your baskets, half your shots. If you're in soccer, it's even thinner than that. And these are people that we say are stars, are superstars, are all stars,
Mhm.
are Hall of Fame players. Well, imagine you applied the same kind of math to business. Because why is it that we assume that every strategy that we come up with is going to be successful? The fact is that most of them fail in significant ways. Businesses continue to think that the pattern of the recipe for growth is buy something or merge with something. That's the graveyard. It's been a graveyard of
Mhm.
business growth strategy for decades now. The vast majority of those transactions fail. There's been recent research that suggests that new hires are more likely than not to not live up to even the minimal job requirements for which those people have been hired. So, in area after area after area, I think the evidence mostly is that if failure isn't likely to happen in the majority of times, it's certainly going to happen in a significant minority of times. And you're going to have to deal with it, anticipate it, acknowledge it, and learn from it if you want to be fully conscious as a leader, as an individual, as an executive.
Well, yeah, and I think I like to tell my students, at least, that the vast majority of ideas are bad, right? But the only way to find the good ones is to kind of spray the ideas out and then weed through them to figure out which of them are any good. But it seems like
Uh,
in a lot of organizations, you have a heck of a time trying to elicit these ideas, precisely because people feel like they have to be, ironclad ideas before they're willing to
Absolutely.
you know.
Ideas are the oxygen, and just what I often ask my clients, and students as well, is I say, when's the last time you were in a meeting and you had an idea, but you never expressed it?
Mhm.
It might have been a question. It might have been a challenge. It might have been just a random idea, but you sat on it. That happens far more than you would ever imagine in most settings. And what that means is that all that's going on between our ears, most of it is staying there. It's staying
Mhm.
in our minds, and we're never talking about it, acting on it. And what happens over time is you either stop trying something new, or you stop saying anything that contributes your unique ideas to the mix of ideas that organizations ought to benefit from. It's a particular issue, I think, for folks who tend to be introverts inside organizational contexts, because most decision making processes, think about most meetings you've ever been in, they're mostly driven by people who are willing to raise their hand, engage, participate. And that is not a strong suit for certain kinds of people who probably have every bit as smart and ideas as those of us who tend to talk a lot more with comfort.
I mean, the behavioralist explanation for that would be that if you take someone who is very vocal and has lots of ideas, and you throw them into an organizational setting, and they vocalize their ideas, and most of those ideas are kind of dead ends. The organization will start to smack them down and start to punish them and start to make them regret having expressed those ideas, and ultimately they'll learn that the just like the rat that gets the shock, they'll realize, hey, maybe I should just keep my mouth shut, because I'm not exactly getting rewarded for taking shots.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've come up with a name for a crime, that I think many of us, both in teaching and many of us in management, commit all the time, and it's the crime of ideacide. We are terrific at killing ideas. You can kill an idea with a snide comment, a laugh, silence, a hostile question. And ideas really are the oxygen. They need some room. They need some breathing room, because oftentimes the first idea is not necessarily expressed as well as it might be. It may not even be as fully thought out. It may be looking for a partner, with another idea or two or three other ideas. And I think if I were giving senior executives in particular, a piece of advice on this one, it would be to hold off a little bit. Give the first draft ideas some opportunity to collide with other ideas, to percolate a little bit. Um, Obviously, they need to be screened and tested and critiqued before you start putting lots and lots of resources behind them. But oftentimes, what passes for ideas are really just assumptions, and common wisdom. And I think if you really listen for the germ behind an idea, even if it's poorly expressed, you might have the basis for some new insights that would lead you in a different direction, more positive than the one you thought you were on, to begin with. And that all goes back to this issue of humility. Um, None of us are as smart as all of us are. Um, Running an organization or planning out a life is not as easy as a recipe in a cookbook. It takes a mix of strategy and improvisation, but above all, I think it takes that curious combination of what I would characterize as confident humility, confidence enough to ask questions and challenge your own assumptions, and confident to be able to hold your own in a disagreement about perspective or ideas, but humility that you don't know the answers. Nobody does. Most of what we do in life and most of what we do in organizations are experiments, whether we use that metaphor or not. That's what we're doing. We're acting and asserting into a realm of uncertainty and the unknown. And I think going all the way back to Edison, in your earlier point, I mean, Edison was a constant experimenter. Now, he happened to experiment around things and technology, but we're all experimenters. The next person we try to hire, that's an experiment. The next team we put together, that's an experiment. The strategy we want the organization to follow, experiment. Experiment, experiment, experiment. And when you think of it in those terms, how many of us expect that every experiment is going to be
Mm.
successful? We don't. There's something about the word and the metaphor of experiment that carries with it the expectation of discovery, even in the face of failure, and often because of failure. So those are just some ideas that have come out of some of the work that Mark and I have done around this phenomenon of failure, or as we call it, the other F word.
Well, I mean, I think Jeff Bezos said that if you know the results of your experiment ahead of time, it's not an experiment,
Yeah.
right? And
What I
if we,
like about how Bezos runs Amazon, the best analogy I can come up with there is that he seems to think of it almost like it's recombinant DNA, right?
Mhm.
That the business is comprised of all kinds of elements, almost like atomic Lego blocks, right? And you never fall in love with the particular configuration of what you've done up to now. You always want to re-look at it, repackage it, look at it from different angles. And that's what I think ultimately led to Amazon Web Services, right? You turn something that was a cost center, a necessary part, a critical part of your infrastructure, and you turn it around and start looking at it as a potential resource to build a multi-billion-dollar global behemoth, every bit as strong in its own domain as Amazon it is in its front office retail environment.
well, this is a recognition that every belief you have is provisional, and that every business model you have is provisional, and every understanding that you have of the world is provisional, and that you'll change it when new information comes along.
If you're humble enough, to recognize it and move, accordingly. And if it were that simple, um, Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma probably wouldn't have been written. The pressing fact is that most organizations, the bigger they become, the less able they are to make those kinds of fundamental redirections. Even when they see their own demise, not in the distance, but coming ever closer to them, they seem in many ways incapable of changing direction, of reconfiguring themselves in the way that I was suggesting Amazon, so far at least, has been doing a pretty damn good job of.
Yeah, and so I wonder on whether it's on the individual level or on the organizational level when we see these failures is as and I mean failures to kind of big failures, and big failures are often a consequence of a failure to learn from little failures, right? I think that was sort of one of the important lessons of your book, which is um, if you want to avoid the big failures, have a lot of little failures. Particularly if when the failures are super costly. And I think that the venture capitalist, I spent a lot of time. I teach a course on venture capital, and I used to teach corporate finance, and they take very different approaches to investments. And among venture capitalists, they do look at themselves the way um, a baseball player looks at himself or herself in terms of success rate. And I think the secret to venture capital is they've figured out a way to lower the cost of failure, right? And if failure is cheap, then you're okay with it with a lower hit rate. And if failure is super expensive, then you're going to do everything you can to avoid it. And if you run into it, you're going to hide it. And if you can't hide it, you're going to delay recognition of it.
Yeah, it's the lens, I think, that venture capital uses is a powerful lens. It's the portfolio lens, right? It's thinking of how do you optimize across a portfolio, which almost by definition suggests that you're going to expect failures along the way, and failures of different magnitude. In an average portfolio with 10 investments, chances are 3 or 4 of them are going to go up in smoke. You're not going to have anything left. And I think the latest research is about 75% of venture capital finance startups never pay back their investors the original capital. So, you're up to almost 3 quarters. So in that remaining 25%, now just think about that in failure, right? Now there are
Mm.
gradations of failure, but you're down to 25%, 2.5 investments out of those original 10. That's where you're going to get your return if you're lucky. And that portfolio thinking, when you apply it back to my Hall of Fame batting average, that's pretty close, right?
Hmm.
you you can do quite well for yourself as a venture capitalist if you're even batting 10%, much less 33% or whatever the equivalent would be.
So for these
It's
large
by the way,
organizations,
it's one of the reasons for your listeners, if they've never seen Bessemer Capital's anti-portfolio, check it out on the web, because it is one of the great examples of a venture capital firm, usually successful, having the sense of humor of the mistakes that it has made,
Mhm.
which include household names that I'm sure they're kicking themselves that they passed on multiple times in some cases.
Yeah. So I mean, that brings us to the question of to what extent we need more role models in the world of failure. I mean, in business school, we tend to bring in all the successful people, and often they will talk in part about some of the failures they had along the way. But I think the exposure to these successful people may cause people to you know oh, uh, ignore the potential for failure, or ignore the way to manage it, or the way to extract value from it.
Yeah, I agree with that. The example that I often use, I happened to be down in Brazil a number of years ago when one of the World Cup competitions was happening, and I stumbled across this article of a game that had happened a day before, I think, where the most favored team, I mean, colossally favored team, lost in a huge upset. And the sports reporter was in the locker room afterwards talking to the coach. And basically, the line of questioning was, how could that possibly have happened? You guys were the overwhelming favorites, and yet you lost. And the coach said, it's quite simple. We were outchanced. And I read that and I cut it out of the newspaper that I was reading. I said, that's a powerful notion. Are you being outchanced by your competition? Because outchancing suggests that they're trying more shots on goal, right? They're trying their own particular version of strategy with whatever talent they may have on the pitch at the time, but they're trying to score more than your team is. And that notion of outchancing, I think, is potentially a way to deal with that question you just talked about. How can you both accommodate the likelihood of failure but not be overwhelmed by it, not ignore it, but manage through it, and more importantly, perhaps manage with it, because failure is a little bit like the coal that holds the diamond. There's insight in every failure. There is something of value that is there to be mined if you have the humility to acknowledge it and the tenacity to go after it. And to that extent, I like this notion of thinking of initiative and action as chances to improve your odds that the experiments you're conducting are more likely than otherwise to prove successful.
Now, in the book, you say that there's a huge judgment element, and one of the reasons why people fear failure is really that they fear being judged as failures, and that there's this conflation between what you do and who you are. And in
Precisely.
psychology, we call it what the fundamental attribution error. Um, is there? How can we, on the one hand, kind of avoid that as individuals, but also how can we avoid contributing to others succumbing to this
Well, I
fundamental
think that
attribution error?
part of the answer is in the question that you ask. It is trying to resist the temptation to immediately or prematurely personalize failure, whether it's your own or somebody else's. One of the things that we suggest in the book is something as simple as changing the order in which you ask questions once a failure has happened. And this was keyed by one of the interviews we did for the book, with a very, very senior and successful guy in business who's been on a number of Fortune 500 boards and run Fortune 500 companies. And he said one of the things that he tries to deal with in his board capacity when a public failure has happened to that company is to resist the temptation on the part of his board members to the question, who should we fire? Who do we need to fire?
Hmm.
And that question of who, I think, should be the last question you ask. What you really want to find out is what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen? And then once you begin to get some insights from answers to those questions, then it might be relevant to ask the question of who. But if you start with who, you are very unlikely to get solid answers to those other more important questions. That's true whether you're asking it of yourself or, in particular, if you're asking it of other people in your organization. And if you happen to be a senior person in that organization and you start with the question who, guess what? You're going to be the last person to know about the next round of failures that's occurring in your own organization right now, today. And you're highly unlikely to get straight answers on where your real vulnerability is, maybe before a competitor takes advantage of it and you find out at your peril.
So, I mean, this sounds like the Toyota Five Whys, right?
Yeah,
That
it is to
that
some extent. No, and some of the beauty of that approach is the inherent wisdom in not taking first answers and getting the answers to the most important question of all. Why? It's not about who.
Mhm. So, in some of the other podcasts, we've been talking about education, not only of students but also of children. And we talked a bit about how organizations can encourage a healthy relationship with failure, so as to extract as much value as possible from experimentation. Uh, how can we encourage students and maybe even children that to kind of embrace this approach relatively early in the process? I talked to Barry Schwartz earlier, and we said companies should recruit for the things that they find difficult to change, and train the stuff that's easy to train. And it's easy to train someone in something like machine learning. It's very difficult to teach them a disposition or a psychological profile. So that's probably going to happen earlier in the process. So to what extent can we get in earlier and help people to uh, overcome this dysfunctional relationship with failure?
Um, Lots of possible answers there. But in the spirit of the question, it's something that would benefit earlier and earlier than most people ever get a chance to to see a different approach to failure. I mean, think about it going all the way back to your own grade school experiences, right? How easy it is to ostracize somebody, how easy it is to point the finger, make fun of somebody, feel like you're better than somebody else. I mean, those are social attitudes and social patterns of interaction that happen very, very early in life. But I think that to some extent takes teachers off the hook, because teachers and parents too, are role models around this question, because failure is on the other side of learning, I think, in most cases. It'd be nice if we could all learn from other people's experiences, right?
So you're saying if you get a 30 on the test, you get an A, right? I tried that with my undergrads. I was not a popular instructor.
Yeah,
And 30 was
if
CA.
success were the way that we learn things, but the fact of the matter is, most of us learn things through making mistakes, through failing of one sort or another.
Mhm.
And how to model, uh, showing people that the mistake is the path to learning. The mistake is the indication of what needs to be understood a little bit better, what might need to be reframed in some way, but that it is on the path to learning, on the path to education. I have the good fortune at Princeton, to teach a freshman seminar on failure. So these are students that are talented as all get out. They come from all over the world, and this is their first year at one of the best universities in the world. And here they are taking a seminar on this topic that most of them most of them are afraid of or ambivalent about at the least. And one of the first things that I ask those students to do is to draw their mental image, of failure, their mental view of failure, and it is fascinating, to see it. And it's led me to connect it with a lot of the work that I do with large organizations, big businesses and government agencies and nonprofits and the like. Um, and my conclusion is this: that for too many of us, although we like to talk about experimentation and we like to talk about the importance of trial and error, in fact, too many of us feel that this is trial and terror, that we are very, very afraid of the judgment that comes, the isolation that comes, the
Mhm.
ridicule that comes from failing on a personal level, on a professional level. And each of us processes those failures in very idiosyncratic ways. It's a highly subjective topic, which makes it all the more important I think, in a life and in an organization, to create an environment in which people can talk about it, can compare perspectives on it. Because oftentimes, by talking about it, you can change your perspective. Was that really as serious as I thought it was? Was that as big a screw up as I feared it might be? Because oftentimes you find out that other people have been having their own version of the experiences that you're having, and it can lend you a shoulder sometimes, but also another lens through which to look at the situations that you're in the middle of that you haven't been particularly pleased with or proud of.
Well, so one approach that you talk about in the book is if someone comes in second place, that just means they're top of the loser pile.
That's what one of our, if I remember correctly, she was an astronaut,
Huh.
one of the first Asian American astronauts, and that was the philosophy that her parents brought her up with.
Yeah, I was talking with Esther Wojcicki, and she was saying that that's kind of like the tiger mom approach, and and um, and the alternative to that we see a lot is that everyone gets a blue ribbon, right?
Yeah,
And
there's in
that
between
no,
though. I'll give you a good example. Sarah Blakely. Sarah Blakely is a hugely successful entrepreneur, the founder of Spanx. And one of the things that she attributes her success to are the dinner table conversations that she and her, I think she has a brother, if I remember correctly, had every night growing up. And her father would ask them questions of the day, and the question was, "What did you fail at today?" And
Mhm.
it was not asked in a punitive, judgmental way. It was asked to ask the child to say, "What did you do that pushed your comfort zone? What did you do that you tried today? And what did you learn from that effort to get outside your comfort zone?" And what Blakely suggests, and we discussed her in the other book that I wrote more recently, the Built for Growth book. Um, she attributes a lot of her own success as an entrepreneur to those early attitudes about failure and the importance of failure, to fuel the continued discovery path for entrepreneurs or innovators for that matter. So there's an example that's not the Tiger Mom example, and it's not the A for effort example.
Mhm.
It's a more focused and I think savvy approach that a parent can take and that a child and that a teacher can take, to encourage a better attitude around the importance of this phenomenon called the other F word or failure.
And I think that probably that middle ground is one way to kind of stave off the kind of depression and anxiety that we see at a high level among younger people today. That we
Very
read
much
about.
so. And to some extent, I think that comes down to this isolation. That when you fail, for many of us, it's an isolating experience.
Mhm.
And when you're isolating, by definition, you're not talking about it. You're not talking about what's just happened. And I'm not suggesting that organizations should turn into some massive, failures anonymous, kind of self-help group. But um, if this topic is not talked about in your
Mhm.
organization, don't kid yourself. People are afraid of it.
Yeah,
People are afraid of it. It's still happening in your organization. You're not superhuman. It's
yeah.
happening. It's happening all over your organization. So figure out a way to get it out of the closet. Figure out a way to talk about it and demonstrate through personal example that you're comfortable with it and that you've learned things from it. And you will find that it potentially has a multiplier, a positive multiplier effect across your organization in terms of encouraging a freer flow of ideas, a greater likelihood of people taking initiative, of trying things that might lead to a better answer than the things you're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our classrooms we don't necessarily need to turn them into therapy sessions, but we
No,
we can we can I think we can model the idea of throwing up ideas and having them ripped to pieces and being like, well, okay, that's cool. Let's move on. That's the great idea, great insight. Thanks for educating me.
absolutely.
Time to
Absolutely.
move
It's
on.
nice to be it's nice to be proven wrong in that
Yeah.
situation.
So in the time we have left, I want to turn to your other book here on
Sure.
Built for Growth. And the way in which you preface this book is to say that there's so much out there on, how to succeed in business and how to succeed in life. And yet many of the things that people talk about are things that are beyond your control. And the one thing that is within your control is your personality to some degree at least. And I found that surprising because, when we think of personality, we tend to think of that as the thing which is the least changeable aspect of ourselves and our lives. And, we're told that you take your Myers-Briggs test and that's you. That's who you are. You take your Big Five personality test and like that's you. And it's all about figuring out how to align the job with your personality and align your organization around your personality. And I think you have a little bit more of a nuanced view, which is that there are these personalities that are built for growth, and there are certainly roles and organizations that fit with them, but that you can kind of modify them around the edges to take advantage of the strengths and avoid some of the weaknesses. How
Yeah,
malleable is to maybe talk a little bit about these personalities that you've identified, and then
sure,
talk a little bit
sure.
about how malleable they are?
This is my colleague Chris Keeney from Princeton and I did this book based on the research that we did looking at highly successful entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, mostly in the U.S., although not exclusively in the U.S. And we identified four fundamental characteristics, four profiles. The driver, you could think, people like Steve Jobs, right? The name sort of connotes the characteristics. And by the way, these four come out of more combinations and permutations of answers to our questionnaires than we could accommodate, and that's where we used a patented algorithm that Chris had developed in his business. But it looks fundamentally at the differences of how people are motivated, how they make decisions, how they lead, and how they manage. And out of that came a questionnaire that we ended up being able to boil down to about 10 questions. And out of all of that research, we identified these four. So driver is one, um, captain is another, crusader is another, and explorer is the last one. Drivers are, by their label, driven. These people are tenacious. They oftentimes fall into the trap of what Chris and I would call product narcissism. You criticize their product, you're criticizing them personally. And there are many examples, of people in that category. Explorers are kind of systems thinkers, right? While the rest of us are working on sections of the jigsaw puzzle, they're sort of figured out what's the box top, how do things get put together. They're curious. They're not as fixated on product. They're fascinated by the puzzle. They're fascinated by, the complexity of it. And that's where I was talking about Sarah Blakely from Spanx. I think that's where a Sarah Blakely or a Jeff Bezos might be. They're constantly looking for the system solution. And then you've got crusaders. Crusaders, by their name, are folks that are fundamentally motivated by mission and vision. They're playing for a long range, big ticket. I want to change the world, or I want to change a big industry in some way. Ben and Jerry's would be a great example. They were very much accidental entrepreneurs, but their vision had something to do not with selling ice cream. It had to do with making people more socially and politically conscious. And then you have people that we called captains, and the captains are more in the vein of a player captain, not the captain on a ship. And Jack Ma, we think, is a pretty good example of that. Jack Ma, when he was organizing Alibaba, to just tie it back to our previous conversation, having endured a lot of failures in his own life and professional life, he took that trio that every business has to figure out priorities for. It's am I in business to please stakeholders, investors, customers, or employees? And most companies, as you know, Greg, would answer that question despite their rhetoric. I mean, they'd act on the basis of investors first, customers second, employees third, right? Ma turned that around. Ma said it's about employees. Because if I've got an environment that creates happy employees, chances are that's going to rub off in better customer service. And if I can put those two together, I'm probably going to have a relatively successful business that ought to keep my investors happy. So those are just quick snapshots of the four types. To your question of the rigidity of these kinds of personality profiles, the best way to think about them is, let me use my glasses as the example, right? They're a set of lenses through which you can understand yourself, and you can potentially understand collaborators that you're working with. They're not straitjackets. MBTI, Myers-Briggs, is one set of lenses, right? And that's kind of looking at you independent of context. Our builder profiles from Built for Growth is another set of glasses that looks at you as a potential successful entrepreneur. Gallup's Strengths Finders is yet another set of lenses that you can look at yourself as a potential entrepreneur,
Mhm.
right? Whether you're going to be successful or not, just whether or not entrepreneurship might be a good path for you to take. So they are lenses. They give you different perspectives on yourself. Are you locked in to being one way or another? No, you're not. Does it mean it's easy to change? No, it's not easy to change. But that's what leads us at the end of the day to these two fundamental choices. You can be a master and try to be an all-around talent, right? Be the equivalent of the decathlon athlete. Even though you're great at one event, you're also going to try to be great at several others. Or you could be the specialist and you're going to be the expert in emphasizing the strengths you do have. And either of those two paths makes sense, depending on what you want to do in your life and what you see as your path forward for your career. And there are many, many people who've done both, one done either of those two strategies. So I don't see it as a straitjacket. I see it as simply a helpful lens through which to understand yourself and how you can interact more effectively with other people who aren't like you, as well as other people who are in the contexts that you care about. Do we
I mean,
lead differently? Yes. Do we run businesses? Do we build businesses differently? Yes, but that's not anything more different, more unusual than are we different at home with our kids than we are with our colleagues at work? You know, do we have a public persona and a private persona? Yes, we do. We change our behavior based on context. So we're much more flexible than we give ourselves credit for sometimes.
and I think a big part of education is getting to know yourself and figuring out what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Very much
And I
so.
know there's a debate that I hear from a lot of people, which is, should you be working on on your weaknesses, or should you be building on your strengths? For a lot of us growing up, the message was, dwell on your weaknesses and try to patch those holes. And increasingly, I hear from a lot of people that that's not the best use of your time. Maybe understand your strengths and just build on them and outsource your weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
Go find
Yeah,
someone else.
we've got several examples in the book of that outsourcing strategy. You know, I don't know. Maybe there's a Calvinistic root in that earlier advice. You know, focus on your weaknesses, focus on your sins, as opposed
Mhm.
to celebrate and hone the strengths that you have. I think maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, and that is to polish and be proud of the strengths that you come by naturally, but also be willing to acknowledge and accommodate to the weaknesses as well, because it's those weaknesses and it goes all the way back to our failure discussion. You know, the being able to acknowledge your rougher edges, your weaker edges in your own personality may give you an ability to interact more effectively with other people who can
Mhm.
compensate precisely for those weaknesses. But if you assume that you are all strength and no weakness, you're kidding yourself.
Now, these character types that you came up with, these personality types, they're really meant to describe people who are running organizations, and the examples you use are leaders of organizations. Um, do these personality types extend to non-leaders of organizations? And I'm
That's
thinking
it.
even in people's in their own personal lives.
Yeah.
You have a family, you have you have a community, you have friendships. It would seem like when I reflected on these ideas, I looked and said, "Well, how do I behave? I don't run a large organization, but I can see these attributes in different parts of my life."
Yeah, I don't want to overstate um, the use of the frameworks that we came up with, because you know we did our research around entrepreneurs, around successful entrepreneurs, people who have built businesses that have stood the test of time and that have stood the test of scale.
Mhm.
So our research is within that context. That's an important context, right? These are this is the engine of economic development and growth and prosperity, et cetera. But we didn't look at people just as people, if you will.
Mhm.
let me go back to my lens, my lens analogy. These are dimensions of people, right? These are dimensions of individuals in a particular context. Undoubtedly, there are dimensions of those personality profiles, those four builder types, as we call them, that do connect outside the context. But when I'm teaching a course on this, I use basically a pentagon approach, right? And I say at the center of that pentagon is you as you. Forget context. It's just you as an isolated individual. At the base of that pentagon is basically something maybe like an MBTI or a five, the five dimensions or a Hogan analysis. There are any number of tools that can help you understand you as you, right?
Mhm.
But then there are other tools available for you as a leader, you as a potential entrepreneur. That's where Gallup's Strength Finders comes in. Or you as a potential successful builder. That's where ours comes in. Or you as a team member. And those are just five different contexts of understanding facets of who you are. I think you could do the same kind of analogy and say, who are you as a parent? Who are
Mhm.
you as a peer, as a friend, right? I just don't have the vocabulary for
Mhm.
for those contexts. Would I be surprised that there may be some similarity and some overlap to some of those other frameworks? No, I wouldn't. I just think that's research that I'd love to be able to conduct or see other people conduct at some point.
And I think you had mentioned in the book a little bit about some of the educational backgrounds of some of these folks, and you were looking for some patterns, and you mentioned that Jack Ma was an English major, and Stuart Butterfield I think was a philosophy major, and did you see particular
No
types
patterns.
of
No
no
patterns.
patterns
I used
at
to
all?
I used to think, again, you may have had this experience in some of your classes. I often ask students, I say, "What's your expectation of career path?" And the younger the student, the more linear the idea of career
Mhm.
path is, right? A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And I said, be prepared. It usually ends up being much more like a zigzag pattern or a pinball pattern from most people that I know that are successful. And that's been true for many of the people that we interviewed for our book. There are people that after the fact can connect the dots in ways that seem plausible, but as they were living through those dots, those individual experiences, they seem kind of unconnected to one another. And that goes all the way back to, it doesn't matter what major you took. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter whether you were a jock or not, whether you were successful or not. Those are just points in your resume. They're not directional in terms of where you've ended up.
So in both of these books, really, there's an emphasis on self knowledge. There's an emphasis on um, strength finding. There's an emphasis on reflection, and you're in the business of teaching, and you teach at a business school. You teach at a liberal arts university. Um, to what extent do you think that we really need to start incorporating this more formally into our pedagogy, right? I mean, you come to business school and you learn operations and you learn economics and you learn accounting and a lot of the other stuff, if it is taught, it's kind of just taught implicitly. But you have specific courses where you
Yeah.
incorporate this material. Is this something that's scalable? Would you encourage other schools to think more carefully about working on the development of people's self knowledge and capacities?
Yeah, very much so. Um, you know, the questions of how and what are interesting. They're important. Uh, those are skill sets, right? Um, but the questions of why and who, I think, are the more powerful questions to delve into. Um, why has a lot to do with purpose and meaning and priority and values. And who is ultimately both what you're going to have to face yourself in deciding what you want to do with your time, your talent, your love, your passions, And also, chances are you're going to be doing that with other people. Unless you're a solo artist, and that's all you're ever going to do in some studio isolated from everybody in the world, um, you're going to be dealing with other people and understanding other people, but beginning by understanding yourself is, I think, the ultimate resource that we all have available to develop and to test and explore. And if we can do that with a mix of self knowledge, but also awareness and accommodation to the fact that people are different, that other people are going to be wired differently, think differently, behave differently. And out of that diversity is likely to come both better insight for all of us, better discovery for all of us, and better results for all of us. I think we'd be doing our students a favor by exposing them to those kinds of why and who questions earlier in their education and throughout their education.
And with that, John Danner, Built for Growth. Check this one out. And of course, the other F word, which is still out there. Highly recommended. Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Greg. I appreciate it. See you later. Bye bye.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.